dear speakers to take their discussions out of this space. And welcome everyone to this session. You're getting an overdose of European perspectives here in these 2 hours, and I agree that having 4 philosophers on stage, probably 50 minutes is not enough. We'll have to end sharply on time because two of our authors actually have a plane to catch, as you have heard already. So let me start. I'm Alexandra Büchler, and I will very briefly introduce the speakers. From my, can you hear me better? Okay, you should wave at me if you can't hear me. From my far right, we have Cristina Sanchez-Andrade, who is an author living in Madrid. She's from Galicia originally, but she writes in Spanish, and she has 8 novels to her name. She has been widely translated and has received several important prizes for her novels. Her work has been translated into quite a number of languages, from Portuguese to Russian and English as well, and this would be her novel, The Winterlings. Mercedes Cebrian, next to her, is also an author from Spain, from Madrid as well, and she is a novelist, a poet. She writes essays as well, and she is a translator. I was given one of her books, which is her book in English, and it's a collection of writing on food, on all sorts of aspects of food, eating, cooking, shopping for food. And I only got it last night, so I haven't read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it because I think food is incredibly important. It's a cultural phenomenon. And the book is called Burp, Gastronomical Writings. So I would recommend that one. And David Szalay is an author who you may have heard about because he is a British author, and of course British authors are better known here in India than authors from other parts of Europe. He was actually born in Canada. He grew up in Britain, and he now lives in Budapest. And he lives in Budapest because he's part Hungarian. And he has 4 novels, the last of which was actually shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So that's something that usually does mean a lot. It's a collection of interlinked short stories called All That Man Is, right? And so let's oh, and one more thing which probably you know about, the Granta magazine lists the best young authors, and so he was amongst the best young British authors 5 years ago. So let's now look at the topic that we were given. The title of this session is Europe, or the recent changes in Europe. The changes in Europe, are they to do more with borders or mindsets? I think it's an interesting question because we are certainly witnessing a number of quite alarming changes in Europe. I myself come originally from what's now called the Czech Republic. It's a country that changed its name about 5 or 6 times since the Second World War. And we now have, I live in Britain, but we now have a prime minister who has been dubbed the Czech Trump, because he's a media mogul. In the countries around Central Europe, in Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban is another alarmingly right-wing leader, and in Poland the same thing. So, and then of course we have the huge subject of Brexit, which I could talk about for a long time, but I won't. That is a very significant. It's not a significant change in the sense that it hasn't happened yet, and I hope it won't. But the vote has really, the vote to leave the European Union has polarized the country and has really caused a huge upheaval, not least for the EU citizens who live in Britain, but also for UK citizens living abroad around Europe, notably in Spain. So we would like to talk about these changes and about the question of borders and mindsets, and we would ultimately like to look at how this could be reflected in literature, because books are important. Books can change people's minds. This is why they get banned occasionally. And we have 3 writers here who can give us their views on what this means to them. So maybe we start with you, Cristina.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Very happy to be here. We was discussing before, maybe it would be interesting to bring up some books which talk about this, how these big changes in politics are reflected in literature. And I was sort of thinking of some books, sort of this dystopian, premonitory books. I think this could be interesting. Maybe it's interesting to explain what dystopia means. Dystopia means, it comes from Greek and means this, has a word, this, which means bad, and topos, which means place. So it would mean novels set in a bad place. It's interesting. And then I wanted to bring up this premonitory aspect of novels, because I think without really realizing, writers, we are like releasing our unconscious, or we should be releasing our unconscious side of the brain. It's like, you know, brain has a very rational part, and then the very intuitive part. The intuitive part is the right, and the rational one is the left, and it's like the intuitive part talking to the rational part. This is very interesting. And in many cases, I think writers don't realize that they bring in very important issues. Maybe it takes some time, but it is important. So I thought about 3 books. 2 of them are not very modern, but I think they're a good example of dystopian. One is 1984 of George Orwell, you all know. Another one is 1984 was written in 1948. It's this swapping of numbers. Then I have thought of Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale, which is now very on trend because of this series, the television series. And then there's another one which is quite actual. It's Michel Houellebecq, Submission. So I think the 3 of them are very good examples of books dealing with things which are on the at least important politics. And so, for example, 1984 was really a warning. It's a strong and violent book. I think it aims to disturb, but it wants also to show how easily humanity can be destroyed by its own actions. It was really talking about the state of the world after the Second World War. And I think it also shows the dangers of absolute power in one ruling class. Then we have the Handmaid's Tale, which is a very feminist book, as you know. And there's been this attack which kills the president and the Congress, and then there's a revolution which is led by a party called the Sons of Jacob. And the main character, the protagonist, is the one who tells the story. She's a woman who's kept only for reproduction purposes, because there's a decline in births, and so due to sterility, because of pollution, one hand, and sexual diseases, other. And then we have this other very interesting and I think actual book of Michael Houellebecq, which is Submission. It tells the story of a Muslim party who's able to win the elections in 2022. And what is interesting about this book is that only a few days after it was published, some, gunmen went into Charlie Hebdo and killed, as you know, 12 people. So these are three books which could more or less talk about our subject.
Thank you. I would like to actually take a step back, and I'd like to ask David, I'd like to ask a question which relates to the topic we were given, which is, where does this rise in populism, in racism, in anti-immigration sentiment, in lack of tolerance towards the other, towards difference, towards diversity, where in your view it comes from? You have experienced life in two parts of Europe, which are very different.
Well, they're both sort of notorious now, aren't they? I mean, Hungary and Britain are both sort of, they're both in the doghouse internationally for different, under very different circumstances, I guess, but they're both cited as key examples of the kind of thing that you're talking about. I mean, I do think it's important to stress that it's not really a specific, it is a European phenomenon, but it's not only a European phenomenon. The United States obviously has problems of its own. I think India has issues that are not totally different as well, politically. So it's not only a European thing, which in a way makes it more difficult to look for the causes. Especially when you have, even within Europe, countries in very different circumstances all showing similar signs of drifting into an uglier politics, if we can put it like that. The causes must be very complex. They must, in Hungary, I mean, I'll talk a bit about Hungary perhaps, because I've lived there for some years and I know Hungarian politics at least as well. Or I know the relationship between Hungarian society now and politics perhaps better than I do even in Britain, because I haven't spent that much time in Britain for some years. In Hungary, and also in other countries in the region, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, there are various factors at play that have created this dynamic, both within the countries and in their relationship to Western Europe, which is also under strain and is problematic. Partly it's these countries have been politically repressed forever, really. I mean, they were part of old empires, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, for centuries, and then just when they might think that they were emerging from that, the Russian Communist Empire, the Soviet Empire, arrived, and so and what all of those empires did was they suppressed any expression of nationalism. So that became pent up over, I think we can say, centuries, certainly decades, certainly since the Second World War. The Russian occupation was extremely hostile to any expression of nationalism. So when the Russians left, it was almost inevitable that there would be some sort of nationalist explosion in those countries. And the idea that they would simply be on a sort of totally trouble-free glide path to becoming sort of Denmark, which was, I mean, that's a exaggeration, but that's kind of the view that people had in the early 90s, that everything's fine now, these countries are just going to kind of join the Western norms, they're going to join the Western political world in a very natural, inevitable way. I think that was always naive. They were always going to resist that in some ways, because another important factor is that the cultural developments that took place in Western Europe and also North America, but let's talk about Europe, in the 60s and the 70s, didn't really take place. So big changes in social mores and norms didn't really take place in the same way in that region of Europe. They remain much more conservative socially. They remain much more religious, typically. They have quite a lot in common with American Republicans in that sort of social conservative and sort of religious social conservative thing. And I'm talking now about the bulk of the population in those countries. Budapest or Prague aren't really representative areas. I mean, in the same way that New York would never elect Trump, Budapest would never elect Orban. We're talking about the hinterland of the countries, the provincial towns, the countryside. And because you're dealing with this difference in mores and difference of view of the world that has grown up over decades at least, it's not going to be a simple or quick matter to change it. And politicians who are willing to, but you see, Orban is one of those people. He grew up in a village in Hungary. He's not. Orban, the scary thing about Orban is that he actually believes all the stuff that he says. He's not using that to get power, and because he doesn't really believe in it, he really believes in it. I think it seems I could say with some confidence that in Poland, the people who are currently running Poland, they are operating entirely in terms of their own principles and about which they feel very strongly. So in that part of Europe, even though it's now prospering economically, that is a big source of the energy that goes into it, that manifests itself in a kind of what we regard as a populist politics. In Western Europe, I think it's probably somewhat different. I think there it probably is more like in America, in my view, that my personal view is that it's rooted most deeply in economic inequality, in the way that most people's lives have not really moved on economically for a few decades now, whereas a small group of people at the top have become fantastically and conspicuously wealthy. So there's that, which doesn't really operate in Central and Eastern Europe, because everyone's lives, people's lives are improving economically. It's more of a cultural thing there, for sure. So it comes from different places, which means it's not simple to tackle. There's not one single thing that will solve all these problems, unfortunately, in my view. And And I don't think you can really persuade people. And then we talk about perhaps literature, and I don't think you can you're not going to be able to write books that are going to be able to persuade millions of people that they're wrong, because they believe what they believe, and it's going to be a slower, harder, more uncertain process than that.
Yeah, I think this inability, and I have been experiencing it very acutely in Britain, that there doesn't seem to be a way that we can be talking to the other side. It's literally, there is this
the very fact that you use the phrase "the other side."
Exactly, that's what it is. But how can I talk to people who think that the judiciary, when they remind the government that Parliament actually should have a say in certain things, are described as enemies of the people? So it's become really very, very difficult to have a dialogue, and so how that can happen, how. We can talk. I don't know how it's going to happen. I was reading an article actually in The Guardian, I think it was yesterday, where a communications expert was talking about the fact that the pro-Europeans in Britain actually are using hard facts, figures, and so on, and they should actually be appealing to more to emotions, they should be telling stories. I'm not sure that I believe this.
But it takes many years. You see, again, in Britain, you've got such a long-term thing. You've got decades of the European Union being ridiculed and reviled in much of the media. That has created a picture of what it is, which isn't going to be quick or easy to shift. I mean, the whole, that's the thing. These things are cumulative. They build up over time. They create. People are created by them, and once they're created like that, they can't really change. Actually, the change is then generational. I guess.
I don't have the time, I have to say. Mercedes, you have lived you have spent some time in the Balkans. You spent some time in Serbia. You have also lived in other countries. And in Spain, you have your own problem now, which is the problem of the call for Catalan independence.
Why do you do this to me, Alexandra? I thought we were friends, and you are asking about Catalonia.
You don't have to talk about Catalonia.
I could see the raven flying over me, but I thought it would pass, but no.
What's your view on borders and
I think
mindsets?
You must know this, I am not a political analyst, so my opinion would be the same opinion, not the same, but the same quality, bad or good, of opinion that a pharmacist would have in Spain, or someone who works, I don't know, like a plumber, because I am not really an expert. I've been reading, as all citizens have been reading, because we were worried about this. But as a writer, I think I love the books Cristina mentioned. I totally forgot about Houellebecq, who is quite visionary. But I think my impression is that literature is slow to reflect all this, and it's more journalism or a memoir or a piece of journalism. Like if you are in the actual place on stage where the thing is happening, so you can feel the impressions, how people are reacting. But I think literature has to take its time. It's like more, it's slowlier, it's pace, yeah. So for example, I think in 20 years or 10 years, we will have the Trump novel, or a novel about what's going on in Catalonia. And so I think what we can do is learn from old fiction that was dealing with other topics, but they are not so different after all, because we are all human beings, and societies were a bit similar. So we can learn from old novels and other types of books. I'm thinking of a book written by a Jewish German philologist, Victor Klemperer. Its title in English, I think, is Language of the Third Reich. So it's his notes, because he was a linguist, on how he realized that the German language was being used in a perverse way by the Nazi government. So I have been thinking of that dude very much because I can feel the same use of words that some media are doing.
Yeah.
It's kind of very uncanny. So I am learning from a book written in a different context, but that has similarities.
Yes. But what you say about the media using language and politicians and the media using language in a way which is fundamentally dishonest, and it's the whole sort of public discourse has become, in some ways, fundamentally dishonest. I mean, words are being treated as like weapons, tools to achieve specific ends, rather than to express something true, for want of a better word. And I think one of the important things that literature as such can do is use language truthfully, and to, you know, avoid using language in that way, and to kind of maintain a sort of oasis of purity for language, to preserve it. Because of course it can, as in that book sounds extremely interesting that you were talking about, and 1984 has the same theme very much in it. The degradation of language to kind of political, ultimately sort of totalitarian purposes is always a danger. And one of the functions of literature must always be to lean against that and to maintain a space where that isn't happening.
I also have, it's related to language, something that is very useful for me when I write, and maybe some people who, because we are all writers in a way, we can write maybe on a blog or on our Facebook walls or whatever, is that sometimes we don't write about a topic or about a context, a situation, a reality, but from that reality. This preposition, from, instead of thinking about, for me is important. For example, I wrote a book of poems 12 years ago. It was, finally, people thought, oh, this is about Spain being part of the European Union. I think every topic can be addressed even through poetry. That's my opinion, and I want to do that. So this was a book of poems that was written not about that, but from that atmosphere in which Spain was part of the European Union, and we felt like winners for the first time. Like, oh, finally we are with the winners. Now this book is like too optimistic. It has aged in a strange way, because some people say, oh, this is like, it was visionary, but it was written from a happy moment. Yeah.
This is a very sad thing you're saying, and in a way, I have to say that for me, what's really alarming is that we see these swings, you know, of the pendulum, and it's not even 30 years that the Berlin Wall came down. And I have to say, I was quite skeptical when that happened, but people were optimistic, and we thought that this is really kind of the dawn of a new era, and of course, we were looking towards then really not just reunification of Germany, but reunification of Europe, and look at what's happening now. So, so it is painful, and I'm sorry to hear
you're not
what
being too pessimistic, Alexandra? I mean, let me try and make an optimistic case, because I don't want to, you know. I think that it's too early to say that the idea of the unification of Europe is sort of in ruins on the floor.
I'm not saying it's dead in
I think I'm still reasonably optimistic about it. Clearly, it's hitting some turbulence and some bumps in the road. Brexit being the biggest one, I guess, but also the divide, the sort of fundamental philosophical divide between the countries that joined in 2003, I think it was, the former Soviet bloc countries and Western Europe. That's now coming to the fore, and that will have to be worked through. But I think that in many ways, the unification of Europe is happening, and it's happening through individual people's lives going on every single day. We were talking before about the movement of doctors and patients back and forth across Europe. The doctors going where the patients are rich, and the patients going where the doctors are cheap. You know, that just things like that are the unification of Europe.
Well, your latest book is quite European, isn't it? It
Yes,
has characters,
yes.
it moves.
And
actually,
yes, exactly.
One reviewer described it as, because it was published in 2016, described it as almost a book that could be accused of being putting forward the argument on the side of the Remain campaign, because it is very European. It's about people moving across.
But it was putting forward that argument as a reality. I mean, obviously the book was written before Brexit was even thought of. I mean, I finished writing the book in 2015, before the referendum had even been called. So. So what I wanted to do in that book was very much just describe the reality of a Europe which is becoming more unified, and not in sort of grand political terms, but just in the minutiae of the population's lives and the way people live and the way people move for all kinds of reasons, and the way the number of children born in Europe with parents from 2 different European countries will have increased exponentially over the last couple of decades. You know, and those people are always going to have a more complex relationship with nationality, and therefore with nationalism and all that kind of thing, than previous generations. So, and
identity. I mean, I like the concept of and I refer to it quite often, of concentric circles of identity. You can be you can be Galician, you can be Spanish, you can be European, for example, Cristina. What's your view on what's happening now?
I think descending more into literature, I think in many cases we as writers, we're not really thinking, as you said, I think you said, Peter, David, it's difficult to persuade people to change their minds. I think we are not really, in many cases, we're not really intending to change mentalities or anything, but only to make people think. You know, just to think. It seems a bit silly what I'm saying, but many people don't think. They and so if you give them the chance of thinking, it's important. And I think even if we are not, for example, in my case, I'm not a political writer. I know nothing about politics, but of course, all these issues, all the things are in our normal lives. We are reading, it's in our atmosphere, and in an unconscious way, it all comes out. So it's, you were talking before, I think before we came in here, about Kafka and how he wrote about things. For example, Metamorphosis, which is the story of this person waking one morning and being turned into a bag. Well, I think it is talking about Czech bureaucracy. So there's many ways of, dealing with the different issues. Bureaucracy. But I think at the end we all come into the same. I mean, there's something which it's there. We need to express ourselves, and it will come out in some way. Yeah.
You say this?
Yeah, I would say that what literature can do is to try to develop a good ear about good ear, good sight, good senses, good perception about the values, the symptoms that are, as if a society was someone who is sick, so you have to act as a doctor and see what the symptoms are, like why are we afraid of something, or, for example, I was telling you days before that sometimes, well, every year there is this word of the year. In English, they decide which one. I don't know which institutions decide this, if it's a newspaper or the Oxford Dictionary.
They
maybe.
do it as well, from various people. Yeah.
So this year, a Spanish institution, a philosopher that was the voice of that institution, decided that the word of the year is a neologism she coined, was aporophobia, which came from Greek, phobia, we all know, and then aporo, which meant like poor. So it's fear of the poor, which means, and she developed this idea, and I liked the way she developed it, because she said that it's not all this racism and fear of the other, is more about fear of like they are going to take what is mine. So it's not about only a race, it's more of the poor.
Yes, yeah.
Class issue.
Well, people feel insecure, I guess. I mean, that about economically, culturally, and they don't like that, and they will vote for people who tell them that they'll make that go away.
So they're looking for reassurance.
Yeah.
I think at this point, before we open it up to questions from the audience, I would actually like to pay homage in a small way to a great author who died just now, Ursula Le Guin. And I'd like to read a very short quote from a speech she gave about 4 years ago, not even 4 years ago, when she was awarded the National Book Award for Lifetime Achievement. She's not European, or wasn't European, she was American, but she had this to say, and I think it is really, it somehow speaks to the topic we are discussing here. She said, "Hard times are coming when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality." And she was speaking, she was addressing a number of issues in that speech, but I think somehow I thought this would be maybe a good note on which to close this discussion and open it up to the public to ask questions. Are there any questions? Do we have a mic?
Hello, my name is Ronnie, and my question is, just before some time you said that
Yes. Sorry. What's the question?
Yeah, good evening. This question is addressed to all of you. Maybe somebody can take, or maybe a couple of you. Just heard, I was going through a TV interview recently. So Europe economically has had, for the last couple of years, has a huge turnaround. It's a positive turnaround. That's what I heard. It's growing at 3%, which is huge, basically. Even better than US, which is going right now at 2.5%, though the base is slightly lower if you consider total view. And apart from maybe Italy, all other countries want to be part of the EU. Brexit is over, means that nothing can be done. But
I disagree.
Whatever, means, yeah, you can disagree, but that's taking a long time, maybe whatever. So, but this economic progress, this is a huge turnaround economically. It's filtering across, I'm talking of the equitable distribution of wealth. In India, it's highly skewed, 1% holding 73%, and the Oxfam report of 2016 or 17, where 8 people amassing half of the world's resources. Because in Europe, it's is it filtering across? Because economically, what the figures we are getting, it's been a huge turnaround, the 3% growth, where about a couple of years ago it was maybe around 0% or maybe sometimes negative we were hearing. So that was my question. I maybe apart from countries like Italy, most of the other countries, EU countries, are they are pro-EU basically, not anti-EU or whatever. Is that correct? Means this can be answered by any of you basically.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, as I was saying before, I'm not a massive Euro pessimist. I mean, I think that Europe is going through a troubled time and clearly has problems, but I think it's far too soon to write it off as a project and as an idea, because I think you're right that the countries that are most likely to follow Britain out are the other major net contributors, the countries that give money. One of the reasons that a country like Hungary will never leave the EU is that it receives money every year from the EU. But a country like the Netherlands, if Britain were to make a success of Brexit, if 10 years from now Britain were to be prospering outside the EU, in a country like the Netherlands there would be huge political pressure to follow, I think.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Yes, there were elections in the Netherlands. Yes, yeah. No, I mean, I'm just saying that I don't think Europe's going to fall apart because of Brexit, and I think that if political pressure arises in other countries to leave because of Brexit, it will be rich northwestern European countries. But probably they have a political culture that would be much, much, much stronger than Britain's in terms of being able to put the positive side of EU membership, and a public that feels that it hasn't been so thoroughly poisoned against the European Union like the British public has been. I think, yes, it's true that Europe is, I mean, particularly in Hungary where I live and in the countries of that region, there is really great economic growth and a general sense of, I mean, wages are going up fast. There's a general sense of increasing prosperity. So that in those countries, that's not the source of political friction. I don't think. One question actually is that the general global rise in populist politics. Is that just a delayed response to the crisis of 10 years ago? When in the years immediately after the crisis, people were saying, "Oh, it's amazing that this crisis hasn't produced a political backlash." But probably that was just that those kind of things take years to sort of feed through. So,
well, it has in Britain in a way, and I have to say that
that's what I'm saying now.
But what I find extraordinary is that I do travel quite a lot around Europe, and I never see the level of poverty anywhere that you see in a country like Romania. I haven't been for some time and haven't traveled widely there, but in Britain we have levels of poverty which are absolutely shocking, and you don't see that in other countries. You don't see the masses of homeless people. You don't see figures that tell you that every 1 in 3 children in Glasgow lives in poverty. It is really shocking. I don't think you would see that in Central Europe, for example. Not at all.
I just wanted to say something. I'm glad this gentleman didn't mention Spain as part of those countries which are a bit away from the prosperity, but I don't know if you know that Spain is just coming out of a recession, and in fact, one of the we're talking about Catalonia's crisis. One of the reasons that Catalonia wanted to be independent was that it felt as a region that it was much more developed than the rest of Spain. It's not only a question of language, culture, it is also, but also a question of economic development. So it's a kind of island in between rest of Europe. But anyway, I'm very glad you didn't mention Spain as you mentioned Italy, but not Spain, which is very important for us. That means the image you have from outside is improving.
Question
Hello?
there.
Yeah, my question is that in recent years, Europe has seen a huge migration of people from different countries into Europe, particularly from Arab countries, Syria, Iraq, and Northern Africa. The question is, in the midterm as well as in long term, how do you see this ethnically, religiously, culturally different group, large group of people are getting assimilated into their new home country?
I have an answer. I am all the time trying to address my comments to literature, which is difficult because other comments from me, coming from me, wouldn't be very useful or bright. So what you have said makes me think of countries where immigration had come long ago, like Britain. They have a generation of Indian British writers, Jamaican British writers, and in some countries where we had immigration later, we still don't have these voices of writers who also who can speak about the two worlds they belong to. We start having like I don't know, Chinese, Spanish writer, there is a clear economic reason, also of language, that they have to learn the language sometimes, but it's that they have to survive, first of all. So finally, a writer is a bourgeois character in a way. So it's only when they are settled that they can become a voice of a public voice. And in Spain, and I think in some of the southern countries, European countries, we still need that, those new voices, that in northern countries you have new voices of, mixed races.
I know what you're saying, but I think this is not entirely true, because what has been happening with the influx from the Arab world, especially Syria, but also Palestine, Jordan, etc., that we actually have quite a number of writers now who are exiled in Europe, who are refugees from these countries. And it is an interesting phenomenon, because they write in Arabic, but they are becoming kind of mediators between the two worlds. I'm not saying that they will help anyone assimilate or integrate or whatever, but it is an interesting phenomenon that I have observed.
And in the case of Spain, I think there's an interesting situation now. We've been for quite a long time recipients of immigration from, for example, South America. There were many people coming from Ecuador, Peru, as workers in Spain. And at the same time, we have people who are now very educated people, people who've been to university, just going to emigrating to England, to Germany. So it's a kind of difficult situation, because we have all these what we call brains, just escaping from Spain, and at the same time, we're still getting people from other countries. So it's a kind of weird or absurd situation.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to say is we haven't really mentioned Greece, and Greece is economically in a very bad shape. And ironically, it is, perhaps together with Italy, the country that has historically been the source of emigration to the rest of Europe and also overseas. And suddenly, especially Greece, I lived in Greece for some years, so I have been observing this really with great alarm, that suddenly in the middle of the crisis, Greece has been hit with this huge wave of refugees, and it's coping, but with great difficulty. So it's a kind of another irony of our age that this is happening. Because it was when I lived there in the early 80s, late 70s actually, when Greece joined the European Union, and it was a country that was completely unused to the idea of having foreigners coming to live there. So
and so yes, I mean that's
We're a
part of
couple of
that's part of
expats,
the problem in Central Europe as well now. They just have no historical contact with non-European cultures. So they have they just don't have that historical experience that you have in Britain, France, Holland, and even in Spain with the relationship with South America. You have at least some sort of relationship with a non-European culture, which has deep historical roots.
Of course, and it's a very rich exchange, I think, for literature, and in literature terms, it's something which has been very, very useful for Spain.
Something interesting is that, I know Argentinian literature, I mean the literary industry, and they had a very big crisis in 2001, where they couldn't get their money from the bank. So Greece had this, the same later, I mean we saw it recently, but before that happened, an Argentinian writer whose name is Damian Tabarovsky, he publishes in a small imprint there, and he has developed created characters who have lived that crisis of 2001 in Argentina, how those people who were middle class, they become lower class person. And then in Greece, he was very successful. He was translated because, so it shows us that literature can teach us something. So they wanted to learn from fiction that had to do with a similar situation. And I think Spain is learning a lot from South America. Also, not only, I mean, in many senses, but in one sense is the arts scene. In Latin America, they hardly ever have like funds, like public funds to do something like theater or whatever, and they manage and they produce amazing things. And in Spain, we were quite spoiled in a way for years, getting funds also from the European Union, and then we had to develop the art scene with less resources, and that will show if we were really interested or not
but
in the art.
Somehow I think it seems that can often be weirdly healthy for the kind of artistic culture of a country when the political environment is quite hostile, when there isn't lots of money being handed out by the government. That can produce great work, and I've noticed it sort of repeatedly happening. Maybe just because that once you have a sort of slightly antagonistic relationship, if things get too cozy, it becomes almost too comfortable. Maybe? No? Cozy's good? Just always?
I think we would miss our plane if we had to discuss all this, sure. Because it's really...
Yes, yeah.
Well, I think we'll need to wind this up, so no more questions. I think we just one question. Okay, I hope it requires a short answer.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
The question is, it's my perception that religious-oriented countries don't do economically well. i.e. The whole of Latin America, then our continent, Protestant-oriented countries like England, the UK and Germany have done better than the Catholic-oriented, i.e. Italy or Spain. So will you go along with this thought of mine, or are you going to contradict it? There's something called...
You mean they've done well, they're more economically developed,
countries have done better.
Countries. I think
there's something called Protestant work ethics.
Yeah, well,
PWE.
we don't, I think we don't really think in those terms of religion or not religion. But I don't think in those terms, at least. I don't know what you mean.
The whole of Latin America is virtually zilch when it comes to economics.
I think that what you are mentioning, I think is an important variable, but not the only one. For example, France is a Catholic country, but no, it's like a secular country that has a Catholic tradition, but it's secular, and I think that's the point, to try to be secular, but that's only my opinion.
Maybe you're discovering a new theory. You should write about this, something new.
No, my profession is
but it is interesting. It's a very interesting reflection on the...
I even sometimes think that bad weather creates better economies, like more, the colder the country is, the most philosophers they produce, and Spain is too sunny, so we don't have any,
Food is also important.
Food for thought is important. Okay.
Well, if I may crack a joke on this note, some people think that the Brexit vote happened because of too many Polish plumbers coming to Britain and taking work away from local plumbers. And of course, they would be Catholic plumbers, and they have been very hardworking. So I don't know. I think we'll have to stop here. We could go on, but there is that plane that needs to be caught, and also I think our time is up. Before I ask you to give a round of applause to the panel, I'd like to thank the organizations that have, institutions that have made it possible for us to be here. And first of all, it would be Acción Cultural Española, which has brought Mercedes and Cristina here, the British Council, and Wales Arts International. Thank you. Thank you.